It's just like, we're all at the playground. We're all playing, dodgeball or whatever. We're trying to keep the kids from like taking a baseball and using it as a dodgeball, right? Like that's ultimately our goal here.
Yeah.
It's not to beat up the kid that's winning, right? Like,
Sure. That's true. Yeah. Hello and welcome to the Open Hardware Manufacturing Podcast, the podcast about making open source hardware. My name is Stephen Hawes.
And I'm Lucian Shapar.
And today we have our first repeat guest, Thea Flowers, is back on. Hi, Thea.
Hello.
Thank you for coming back on after the first time you still decided to be part of this again.
willing to talk to us again.
Yeah.
We always appreciate it.
I understand that's rare for you guys.
A reasonable take. And in this episode, we get into a whole bunch of stuff about open source licenses. Thea is very, very knowledgeable about open source licenses, especially how it relates to hardware. So we decided, Lucian and I weren't going to take a crack at this one by ourselves. We wanted someone knowledgeable about it on for this episode. So we get into what's the scope of permissivity. So super, super hands off. You do whatever you want with it versus I'm going to decide how this library, this thing I'm licensing affects your whole project. We get into what do you want to accomplish with your project and why might you license it that way, and also licensing different parts of your project differently, and a whole bunch of other little tangents and stuff that we get into just throughout the course of talking about what does it mean to license something in a way that works for how you want to do it. Yeah, we learned a ton throughout this one. Yeah, like it was just a fire hose brain dump of awesome info.
I'm glad. And if anything is wrong, you can just blame me. And that's awesome, right?
Well, it's not entirely, I don't know. It's our copyright, so I think we still get blamed, right?
Oh, very true. It might not be your fault, but you're now responsible.
Exactly. Yep. And that's fine. I'll take that. This is not legal advice. This whole episode is not legal advice.
I just wanted to quote Thea from later on in the record where she said, open source is about trying to establish a commons of work that other people can use and learn from. All these licenses that you're going to hear from in this episode is in some ways express the author's intent for how these works should be used fairly. All this kind of relates back to that. So
that central thesis.
Yeah. Be cool.
Yeah, be cool.
Just be cool. Just be cool about it.
Don't be an ass. That's kind of that's what we ended on. That's the thesis. Cool. All right, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Yay.
Thea, thank you so much for coming back on OHM. It's good to have you back. You are our first repeat, actually.
Oh, God.
Yeah. The first person we had on for one episode, we were like, yeah, we'll have her back. We'll have her on for another one.
So your judgment is getting worse is what I'm hearing.
I would say no. I'm really stoked to have you on. And honestly, early on, we were like, okay, part of the reason it would be cool to have guests on is like, because eventually we'll want to have Thea on for an episode about licensing. Because Lucian and I think about this kind of stuff a fair amount, but we certainly don't have like the context and the background that we have ever really felt comfortable to talk about licenses in a way that we want to put forth. So like having you on to make sure that what we're saying is accurate and informative is like a pretty important part of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it takes a special kind of sicko to be into licensing, right? Like someone who's like, hey, like if you're at a party and someone's like, hey, can I talk to you about licensing? You're like, no, you cannot.
Yeah.
Please leave. You are not invited.
You just got to go to different parties, Thea. The ones where everyone just wants to talk about open hardware licensing. Then everyone wants to talk about it.
That's actually the kind of parties that I throw. Fun fact.
I have these parties where we get together and read terms and conditions, and I think this would fit in great there.
My friends are talking about doing a PowerPoint party, and I'm like, oh, I used to do do developer relations. I'm like, oh, I used to give presentations all the time. Like this doesn't sound like the most fun I could have at a party, but sure, let's do it.
You would smoke it though. You would really wipe that party for sure.
Yeah.
Also, some context for folks that maybe didn't listen to the episode where we had you on before and gave all the background of you. You are very, very aware and knowledgeable about open source licenses, specifically to do with hardware. Can you give us just a little bit for people that didn't hear that first episode, like what your experience is with that and like why you are so freaking knowledgeable about this realm?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been doing open source stuff for most of my life now. So I started in software and then eventually went into hardware. And I call myself a creative technologist because I literally have no idea what else to call myself. But I am also the president of the Open Source Hardware Association. So I know a little bit about open hardware.
Just a little.
Just a little bit. They let me have the title. It's kind of like, being King of England. It doesn't really mean anything. But yeah, no, I run an open hardware company. I have lots of open source hardware and software, and I help other people navigate that. So yeah.
Cool.
Of course, the standard disclaimer that I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice.
Yes. Neither are me and Lucian.
Please consult a lawyer before you do anything legally speaking. This is legal speculation at best.
Yeah.
But it's well-informed legal speculation, at least.
Right. It's a good guidepost to help you figure out which lawyer to call.
Which is often very hard to figure out.
Yeah, it super is. And like some lawyers only talk about one thing and not another thing. And then you have like a different lawyer for that stuff. And like, it's a messy world. Yeah,
you don't want to call an elder law lawyer for your trademark disputes.
Open hardware trademark licensing. Yeah. The main lawyer for Opulo, just like our contract general counsel, we were like, oh, we're open source. And he's like, what? He did not really I don't want to say agree with, but he was like, what are you doing? He just didn't really know why. And then when we talked to folks who are like patent attorneys and trademark, they know what that is and they know how to handle it a little more. It's not like he did know what it is. He was just more surprised that we were doing it.
Right.
So, the scope, I mean, he's a very, very smart guy. He knew what it was, but it was weird. He doesn't usually deal with that.
It's not the standard business model. Right.
Right.
So it's very strange. It's uncharted territory for a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah. So I think one of the best things to start with about licensing, especially with open hardware, but across everything in general, is and Thea, correct me if any of what I'm saying is just completely wrong here. This is just how I'm thinking about it. There is one main linear axis across licensees, which is restriction. So when you license something out, it's how much am I forcing your hand on how you use this content? From public domain, whatever it's just out there. It's now Winnie the Pooh. You can make a horror movie about it, and everything's in Steamboat Willie now. You can just do whatever the heck you want. There's no restriction, all the way to patented closed source fully. So what is that spread? What is the most and the least, and how does that all lay out in your mind, at least? Yeah,
I think kind of looking at licensing and sort of that spread, that sort of, axis of, extremely permissive to very restrictive is useful. There's other dimensions to licensing. And then you mentioned patents, and that's actually a totally separate conversation.
Right.
They interact with licenses and copyright in interesting ways, but patents offer a different kind of protection than copyright. So
yeah. Okay.
It's very easy to confuse the two. And like I said, they're intertwined but separate. It's really weird.
Yeah.
And yeah, thinking about things from, most permissive to least permissive is a very good way to start.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're just starting to try to figure out what you want to do.
So the least is so I think of a least as being, if you want to make a thing and you're like, all right, I literally don't care what someone does with this thing. It's just out there. Can you just put something in public domain directly? Or is I think it's Creative Commons 0. Is that the license typically of just kind of it's out there, you do whatever you want. It's not mine anymore. Effectively, it's the public's.
Yeah, that's fun. Cause in many jurisdictions, there's not a way that you can explicitly place something in public domain. In some there are, but in most there aren't. So there are licenses out there that are more or less equivalent to something being in public domain, but aren't actually public domain. When you really get to the nitty gritty of it, but are functionally public domain.
Yeah.
So that is the fully permissive thing, right? Where you're okay, you do whatever you want to with it. Just, it's out there. Anybody can mess with it.
Right.
Those licenses we're going to talk about this a little bit later, of course, but there's not a lot of case law. These licenses have not been really tried very often in court.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is the legal recipe of this is what we think will work and hold up in court. And until it's actually tried in court, we don't really know. But
yeah,
there are varying degrees of like, this handles the edge cases that we expect, right?
And when you say these licenses, talking about these, you mean like open source licenses specifically?
Honestly,
right?
all licenses.
Really? Or is there not a lot of case law for like more developed stuff? Or
There are.
Okay.
I mean, but it is ultimately, a license is a contract.
Yeah.
And it's contract law. So like, in terms of like what rights are granted or not granted under a license, are ultimately can be challenged. It can be tried in court. It could be, someone comes after you for using software in a way that didn't match their license agreement with you. Then your recourse is, legal, right?
Right.
It's a contract and you broke the contract, or they think you broke the contract. So the ultimate resolution is up to the court.
Sure. Yep.
So yeah, so like when you're getting into that sort of thing, right? Like you start thinking about, okay, like nothing is real and nothing matters, right?
It's all hopes and dreams until a judge says, yeah, this is a valid contract.
But it's not just hopes and dreams, because again, some of these licenses, which again are effectively contracts, are put together in a way that any reasonable lawyer, any reasonable judge is going to look at it and be like, there is a case here.
Right.
Or some of these licenses, like there's like the WTF license or something, like I can't remember what it's called. Like the do whatever the F you want license.
That's fun. I didn't know that's a thing. That's great.
That are like, like kind of glib, but like they would almost certainly not stand up to anything in court, right? Like,
oh, really? Yeah.
In a lot of cases, like if you want to use a project that's licensed under that, and you want to make sure that you have strong legal standing to distribute the works that you make based off that project, you might be in trouble because that license might not actually be granting the things that it says.
Right.
So like, it's a little wild. But anyways, getting back to the question. And again, we'll talk.
That is good context though, of like, it's not like a license is like some dictated thing from the government saying, hey, this is how this is going to work. It's like some dude sat down, wrote a contract, and that contract, everyone's kind of like, yeah, I'll effectively sign this contract by using this content or decide to license my stuff that way and hope that it's like a lease, you can sign it, but then there has to be some legal thing to enforce it afterwards. And each one can be very different. So that's a good context for it.
Exactly. By using the software or the hardware that's under this license, you are accepting the terms of the license, more or less, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So with the public domain licenses, it's basically like that. It's like, saying, I release all of my rights to this, right? And for the most part, those work. Like the ones that are more well thought out and well written, like, CC0 and some other ones are pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't know of any case law specifically around these public domain type licenses, but for the most part, those seem relatively solid. The issue just occurs that like copyright is automatic, right? Like when you make something that is copyrightable, you automatically get the copyright. Right. You don't have to do anything special to get it. And by default, all rights reserved, right? Like no one is allowed to use it but you, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what the public domain license is trying to do, is like change the default from this extremely strong use all of your rights under copyright protection to the opposite of I relinquish all of my rights under copyright, right?
Right. I remember being like 14 and trying to make my own like little personal website in HTML on like my old 13-inch MacBook and realizing that I could put copyright Stephen Hawes like 2012 or whatever at the bottom. And like, I can just do that. I don't have to call a lawyer about that. And thinking that was really weird that I get to just put that on there by default, and how strange that felt just being able to do that.
Well, what's interesting is that you don't even have to do that, right? Like it's automatic. Copyright is automatic.
Is it really?
Yes, it's 100% automatic. If I sit here and I draw a sketch of Steven, that sketch belongs to me and me alone, right? Like it's mine. I don't have to write a copyright sigil on the bottom and like pray to the copyright gods. Like it's automatic.
The USPTO that it's upheld. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's like patents are not automatic, but copyright is. And that's what's interesting is like that notice that what you've put into your HTML file is a copyright notice. It doesn't apply the copyright. The copyright is automatic. Yeah. It just gives people notice of who actually owns the copyright to what you just wrote, right?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting bit.
It's also weird.
It's also fun that like there is some disagreement on this, but in general, when you put a copyright notice on something, it's supposed to be the original publication date. So you don't have to like constantly update the year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
And
funny.
And you don't even have to include the year, right? Like, again, copyright is automatic. So you're just, this is just like useful information for someone who is trying to figure out whether or not they can use this, right?
Right.
So, typically the year that you're supposed to include is the year of first publication.
It's
but
just
like,
a great way to tell if someone hasn't updated their website in a while. That's what I use that for.
Yeah.
You just saved me about 5 minutes a year. Thank you.
yes, please, everyone stop doing that.
Stop.
You
or
are
just
wasting
put copyright. Don't put a,
Yeah. Let the lawyers argue about first date of publication and how long the copyright applies, right?
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
don't waste your time every year pumping the year.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe do it once a decade or something.
Right. Yeah. For that decade, that works well.
Something that's like at odds with me here is that someone can declare that an idea is theirs and release it under an open source license. But like, say I push an internal combustion engine to GrabCAD and say it's create common with attribution share. Like, it's not my right to say that. It's interesting that where a patent has an approval process, there's a patent search. The copyright open source licenses there's no real oversight there. Like someone could get themselves into trouble.
It's like you could have a landlord that gives you a lease that is illegal. Like there could be something illegal in that lease, and like they will still give it to you, and you could still sign it. Like there's no overview of that.
Yeah, I mean it's tricky, right? Because again, patents and copyrights cover different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't copyright an idea, right? Like, you can patent an invention, but you cannot copyright, generally speaking, like an invention, right? So like copyright applies to works. And that's kind of like the key piece there is, right? Like, is like, things that humans create, whereas patents can apply to ideas. So it's entirely possible for someone to, let's say there's some patented 3D printer design, right? Yeah. And someone decides, oh, I'm gonna remake that, and then I'm just gonna release it under open source. Well, while it may actually be completely and totally fine for them to release that under an open source license, it may be functionally against the law for someone to actually build and use that due to the patent held by the inventor, right?
Right.
Because that patent grants them exclusive rights to making money and using that invention, more or less. Right.
Yeah.
So again, licensing and patents tend to be
different.
Separate. There are some overlap, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But like in general, like that's kind of the difference, right? Like just because you can design something or you can publish documentation on something doesn't mean you necessarily can use it if it's patented, right?
Right. Yeah. Like that, it's almost, I think of it like different like levels of abstraction. Like at the highest level, you have a patent, which is for an idea or an invention. Mm-hmm. And then the next layer down is the implementation. And then that's the thing you can copyright. And then the layer beneath that is like an instance. So I'm thinking about the lumen, like an actual physical one lumen is an instance of the implementation of the idea. So it's, kind of those three tiers is kind of how I think about it, but they cover different tiers. It's a different thing it's handling.
Yeah, it's kind of like the idea, like, I mean, software patents have a lot of weird stuff going on, but like you can patent certain things about software, right? Like, I think Amazon has a patent for like one-click ordering, right? And while like really? it's possible to implement that 100 different ways, and you can make all the implementations open source, Amazon still has the right to go after somebody who's using that pattern, that idea, that invention, if they do that. Whether or not that's a good thing or not is a separate conversation, but like that's kind of the idea, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So at our base level, we have public domain, Creative Commons 0. I don't give a flying fart what you want to do with this thing. It's out there. You do what you want. Opposite of the default copyright that goes on everyone's website. What's like the next layer up of like a little bit of some restriction? Like what's a little zhuzh of like, no, I'm going to be a little opinionated about what you do.
Yeah, this is so funny because whenever I'm talking to people or companies who don't know about open source and are like curious how it works, they always want to go from the other direction. They're like, but like I want to keep all my secrets. Like so what's the least amount of my secrets I could give away and still be open source? And it's like Oh my God. So it is refreshing to talk about this from the other direction, right? Of like,
Sure.
I want to give everything away. And then you're like, oh, wait, okay. Like, okay, maybe I want to keep some things. Maybe there's some stipulations I want to put on this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, when you go from public domain and you're looking towards more stipulations on the use of the work and creation of derivative works, you start thinking about what are so-called permissive licenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in permissive licenses, both hardware or software or whatever, you generally have no obligations to reshare your changes or your modification, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you generally have no obligations to publish any source code at all, right?
Okay.
So for example, and a lot of these analogies are easier in software, so I apologize. But so for example, if I wrote a library, that, let's say, found the length of a string, very small library,
Sure,
probably functionally uncopyrightable, but whatever. Let's
the
pretend
npm
that it
function is even.
is even. Yeah, let's talk about my is even function, right?
Sure.
And let's say that I send that out under a permissive license, and you use that in your project. You don't have to publish the code that you use. If you make a small change to it that makes it not return true when you pass it into for some reason, you don't have to publish those changes. You don't have to let me know that you used it. Generally speaking, permissive licenses only ever require attribution, which means that you have to say, this is using this library by this author, right? And in some cases, that attribution only applies if you're redistributing source. So there's a lot of permissive licenses that don't even require you to do attribution if you're, distributing some finished project that doesn't include the source itself.
And you're not including the source.
Yep.
Why is that stipulation there? Why would they only want the attribution to be there for when the source is? You think it'd be the other way around, because when you're sharing the source, you can see where that library is coming from, and it's already kind of like an implicit attribution.
Well, that's kind of the thing, right? Like, that's not necessarily always the case, right? You can grant a license that gives the permission to somebody to use something without any attribution, and you can remove all traces of that original author's intent, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that attribution clause actually makes it where when they do distribute source code, the people who receive that source code have the same rights that the original author granted to the person creating the derivative work. So they have those same rights, right?
Oh, okay.
So
but if it's packaged, it's like the buck stops there, because now you just have a compiled binary or some finished project. So there's no need to cause that license to perpetuate to the next person who takes it on.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. That makes a ton of sense. That's cool. Okay. So this is like, hey, if you use it, give me a shout out in the comments. Like, that's effectively the step above, is just like, and only if you share the source, give me a little shout out. That's kind of like the next tier up here. Okay.
Yeah. And this is also typically, like, you'll sometimes see this in the public domain style licenses, but generally in these kinds of licenses, like MIT license or CERN permissive license and others, you'll start seeing like warranty disclaimers, right? Where it says this is provided without support, without warranty of any kind, like use at your own risk, right? These are the swim at your own risk sort of things, right?
Sure.
So like that's kind of important, because it is, theoretically possible for someone to use your code and then that code have a vulnerability or something like that, or use your hardware and that hardware catch on fire. And it's like, no, by using this and taking it, you are assuming all responsibility for it, basically.
Right. It was like what was that log4j vulnerability, like that Java logging thing? It's like, I don't know what that was licensed with, but I remember a lot of people coming out of the woodwork going to the developers of that and being like, hey, you need to fix this right now. And they're like, I'm going to fix it, but not because you're telling me to. Like, you don't get to demand that I do that.
Right. Like, it's something like, from a social perspective, hard to fight with open source stuff. But from a legal perspective, almost all licenses at this point include, disclaimer of warranty, where it's like, no, like you use this, it's on you, homie. Like,
so there's really no open source licenses that are like, yeah, you can totally come after us if there's a bug in this, and like you get to blame us for it. Like, that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Interesting.
It would be a little bit counterproductive to the spirit of open source, right?
I think so. It's going to make someone not want to share their thing with it,
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It discourages, it's antiviral, it's anti-mimetic. Like, it keeps things from spreading.
Yeah.
A common thing of contract law too is that it needs to like benefit both parties. So like I can't think of a reason why you could ever expose yourself in like a one-sided way like that without receiving cash or a benefit that makes that trade-off worthwhile.
Sure. Yeah.
And, there are projects out there that are open source, but offer like commercial support, right?
Right.
And Red Hat being an obvious case of this, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Where like the commercial support contract has, your remedies in case of damages. But yeah, like that's not something you're generally going to find in an open source license.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. Okay. So that's that next step up. And like, if they make changes, they also don't have to say anything about that. Like you can make a tweak, you can make is even actually return true if you give it a 3, and that you don't have to redistribute.
You don't have to redistribute.
Super permissive.
Yep. Super permissive. Basically, do what you want. Just, don't prevent people from also doing that if you distribute this as source code, right?
Right.
Don't remove the license and then send it out there to the world. That's
sure.
That's usually the one thing that's disallowed, right? Like,
okay.
When I say remove the license and send it out to the world, I mean remove the license from the source files,
right,
and send them out into the world, right?
Sure. What is an example of a license like this?
Oh yeah, so like the MIT license, the BSD 3 clause license, Creative Commons. I think just like the CC by 4.0 is that I have a hard time remembering all their little
letters.
Little combinations.
Sure.
Yeah. So like those licenses would be like that. And for hardware, you'd have CERN OHL
permissive.
P. Yeah. Permissive.
Yep. Cool. Okay. So then what's the next step from there? Like now you want to put a little bit more strings on this.
Sure. For that, I also want to mention the Apache license. The Apache license is a software license. So again, not super applicable to hardware, but applicable to any software that runs on the hardware. But the Apache license is an extremely well architected version of a permissive license for software.
Okay.
And it's a lot longer than the MIT license, which is like a paragraph.
Yeah.
It's a lot longer than the BSC 3 clause license, which is 3 sentences, right?
Yeah.
Creative Commons is also extremely well written. That's one of the great things about them.
Yeah.
But for the Apache license, what's kind of unique about it, and this ties back to patents, is that it has an explicit patent grant. So if you create some open source software or whatever, and you use your patent as part of that software, and you publish that under the Apache 2 license, the people that receive that software or use this have an explicit license to use that patent within the confines of that software.
Whoa, really?
And that is an extremely good thing to have for larger companies publishing and using open source stuff.
Sure.
Because they want to make sure they're not going to open themselves up to a patent lawsuit by using open source software or hardware.
Right. Yeah. So it gives a lot of security to the users of the copyright, knowing there's no chance that the person who did the licensing and probably has the patent on it could ever come after them.
Right. And it also has a reverse clause where if the person using the software and using your patent decides to sue you over patent dispute, even if it's a different patent altogether, then their license, the explicit license that you'd given them through Apache 2 is revoked. So like, it's kind of this, I wouldn't say mutually assured destruction, but like it provides a benefit to both to behave in a way that is going to be in the spirit of open source, where it's like, cool, I'm not going to mess with you if you use this software and you use the patent that we have around this software, and you don't mess with me. Right.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because it that kind of says, hey, we're just going to kind of not do the patent thing here, which kind of begs the question, why would that company then patent that thing? Because kind of the whole point of patenting that idea is to keep other people from using it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like, that's kind of how I think about them, is like to enforce it and put legal money behind making sure other people can't do this and try and have a monopoly on the idea. Why would you patent it and then choose to use the license that explicitly grants the rights to not pursue the thing you paid all this money for? Like, what's the benefit of that?
It's complicated, and it's a whole other discussion.
I'm sensing a theme here.
It depends.
It depends.
It depends. But part of it is like, especially in the context of software patents are tenuous at best.
Yeah.
And when actually challenged, it's unclear how many of them would actually hold up. Right.
Right.
So ultimately, like, software patents is kind of like this arms race where it's like, all these large corporations want to have enough patents to ensure that other companies don't try to come after them for patent infringement and vice versa, right? So it's kind of like, like I'm not gonna shoot you with the 700 guns I have in my house if you don't shoot me with the 700 guns you have in your house. And if they get another gun, you have to get another gun, and it just keeps on going and going and going.
Sure,
and going, right? So,
okay,
yeah,
interesting. Yeah, I'm sure with the ambiguity, like if it was just a perfect clean system, it might make less sense. But it's just a security thing.
Yeah. And it's also like, the other thing of like, it kind of gives a little bit more bite to some of these projects that have patents behind them, because if someone does infringe on, or like does decide to not follow the terms of an open source license, then they also lose the right to the patent behind the project, which opens them up to a different level of legal recourse than just coming after them for contract law. Now it's patent law, and it's a different way of getting at that and enforcing these licenses.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's kind of feels like mutually assured destruction, kind of.
Yeah.
It's important to say how silly all of this can shake out in a court of law. Like there's a famous Apple versus Samsung case where the jury found Samsung infringed on a utility patent where the screen will bounce when scrolling.
Yep. Yeah. Ultimately, no tech company wants to go to court and try to stand on software patents because it's going to be a mess.
Yeah.
And you never know which way it's going to land, right? So,
right. Yeah. It feels probably like a gamble for a lot of companies that do try and get them, of like, it's just kind of like this big, scary weapon you're waving around in the air, like, hey, maybe this would pan out, but it's not a definitive, like, I will win if I have this patent on it. It's just kind of supposed to be like a deterrent, trying to keep people from challenging it.
Exactly. Yeah.
What a weird system.
It is. U.S. patent and copyright law is very weird. And so is European. Can't really comment much on, any other countries, but yeah, it's weird stuff.
Yeah, that is strange.
But yeah, going back to the question of like, okay, I want something that's slightly less permissive than a permissive license, right?
Yeah.
What do I do? And at this point, we start looking at reciprocal licenses, right?
Yeah.
Which is a fancy word, but basically means like, like a bit of the golden rule, right? Like, I gave you this for free, so you also have to participate, right? Like, yeah, it's kind of that, right? So the first kind of reciprocal license that we sort of get into, going on this like sort of gradient from most permissive to least permissive, is a weakly reciprocal license, right? So basically, this says that, for the most part, these function more or less like permissive licenses, except for the fact that if you make any changes to this work, to the software, to the hardware design, whatever's published under this license, you have to release that, right?
Yeah.
It's saying that you can use it in a commercial work. That's fine. You can, if you use it unaltered, cool, right? Like, have fun.
Yeah.
If you make modifications to it, though, you should release those under the same license, right? Under the same licenses and under the same weekly reciprocal license, right?
And it's only the changes.
Generally only the modifications, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, an easy example of this in software is like, you're building the next great app and you're like, oh, I'm going to use this library, right? And it's like an animation library or something, right?
Sure.
And you make no changes to it. You just install it from a package manager, use it as is. Cool. You probably need to include, attribution in like a notice file or in like the open source licenses little thing in your dropdown or whatever. But other than that, you're good to go, right? Like, you're fine. You can distribute it as binaries generally, like it's fine. Yep. It's just when you make changes to it, when you alter it, if you make, any sort of transformative works from that thing, you need to publish the changes, right?
Right.
So,
yep.
So yeah, it's like that's sort of the weekly reciprocal licenses,
which is just asking for if you, and it doesn't even necessarily mean an improvement, because I think about weekly reciprocal licenses a lot with the Lumen of this like. Yeah, I mean, it could just be an alteration that's
subjective, right?
Exactly. That's my point. Yeah, because like, let's say someone wanted to use the Lumen, if the Lumen's, let's say it's licensed weekly reciprocal. Someone wants to make like a really fancy pipetting machine out of it, and they use the Lumen bone stock, but they just change the parts on the head that hold the nozzle or whatever to actually hold some other thing, right? that it does the pipetting. They would only have to re-release the source for that one file and not any other thing that goes into that product, not any other aspect maybe that they glom onto it or add new. It's just if they edit that existing thing, which is cool, but also I may not care about that piece because it's for a different application. It just makes it so that I could decide, hey, this is awesome. This is an improvement. I'd love to roll this back in if the main project chooses to do so. Is that a fair assessment? I saw a look on your face of as I was saying that.
No. That's a fair assessment. And like the scope of like what counts basically is different depending on the license. But like,
sure, yeah.
For the most part, like, yes, it's modifications to the project itself, right? To the actual work,
right? And
not necessarily like the subsequent work that uses that work. It's not subject to the same license terms, more or less.
Yeah, which is nice because then you can. It's not that opinionated. It makes it so that the main project can get some of the benefit of the fact that other people are using it and improving it, but it doesn't like really force you to do anything other than, hey, look how I modified your file. I'm going to keep going back to doing what I want to do, my own thing. And you don't get to influence the rest of what I'm working on.
Yeah. And there are some that do take that a little bit further, where there are requirements of like derivatives works that use something like that. And like an example of this is, sort of the almost 90% sure it's the LGPL's like linking clause, where it's like, if you create a commercial product or anything where you're distributing it as a binary file, it's compiled, you're not distributing the source code, but you're using a library or something that is licensed under this, the user has to have some way of swapping out that library. Whoa. And that can be an extremely onerous requirement, right?
You need such a like robust API and a second option, like to be able to pull out a whole chunk of it. That's wild.
Yeah. And like, some people, like there's guidance on how to like comply with this, and there's multiple different ways. Like dynamic linking is one of them. So like they can make their own DLL and your program will grab that DLL or something like that.
Right.
Or for some people, like they'll distribute the object files, and then someone could link in a recompiled version of that library.
Wow.
That was under the, this particular license.
Yeah.
And that's how some people get around that. And like, again, it can be a pretty hard requirement to deal with if you're not distributing the final thing under an open source license as well. So
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that one's tough. But yeah,
that's a lot.
A lot. And and now we're dipping our toes into what a strongly reciprocal license would look like.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. As you said once and has stuck in my brain forever, cookie licking licenses.
Yeah.
I love that so much. I think it's such a funny way to describe it.
Yeah. Like, so, with strongly reciprocal licenses, we also kind of call these viral licenses, where if you use this in something, if you use this in a derivative work, that larger work must also be under the reciprocal license, the same reciprocal license or a compatible one.
Yeah.
And that is interesting.
It like infects whatever project it touches with that license.
Yeah, exactly. It's viral. And you can read more about this, like if you look up like copyleft and things like that, right?
Yeah.
This sort of whole movement of like trying to subvert the copyright system, where instead of protecting the rights of a corporation or a creator, it's more that the project's license tries to perpetuate the rights of everyone, of the public, right? So it's kind of like this idea of like, no matter what you do with this, it has to also be put in, out in the world in a way that everyone else can use the same rights that you had access to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it really probably does work very well, because like, I think GPL is the best example of very
GPL
strongly reciprocal license.
Is a great example. And the Linux kernel uses it, right? Like there are lots of great projects out there that use GPL to great effect, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, in a lot of ways that can make a lot of sense for a project, but for other projects, they might not make any sense at all for it to do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it definitely does work. If there's like a great little library that you want to put into your thing, and it's like the only game in town, it's the best implementation, it works, whatever you're doing, like what other choice do you have? Like, okay, cool. I guess my thing is this license now too. And then Now that wants to get incorporated into another module, and then it's going to keep spreading up. And I think that's why it's so prolific, is like, I think it's partially because people have the copyleft ideology of like, I want to kind of force this open thing onward from this project forth. And they have like a license obligation to do so as well.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like I think personally, it makes a lot of sense for something like Linux, right? Where like, this is some fundamental piece that, you know, can run other things that can be under different licenses that, you know, interacts with the world at large, right? And having that part of it be strongly protected by like copyleft principles is a really good idea.
Yeah.
There are other things where I'm like, it probably doesn't make sense for that to be strongly reciprocal. Like, you know, the example of my is even library function, right? Like yes, you probably don't want that to be, you know, a viral license, like copyleft sort of situation, because you don't want every project that uses that to have to be that way, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's also really easy to just re-implement and not have to use it. So you're not going to get a lot of people using that license or that thing too.
Well, yes, but like, yeah, I mean, it'll also throw up barriers to adoption, right? Where it's like, like you can do that, but maybe nobody's going to use it, right? Like it would make little sense for like a programming language's standard library to be strongly copyleft, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes a lot more sense for those to be permissive, because anyone who uses that programming language to create a binary file now has to contend with that sort of thing, right?
Right.
So
A lot of the times when I'm in a discussion about strongly reciprocal, it's argued from like a philosophical stance. So I wanted to ask you if there's examples where a strongly reciprocal license is like de facto what you should do. It makes sense. It's not coming from a place of opinion.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, again, the Linux kernel is a great example of this, but I think things that like offer a broad public utility are good candidates for something that is strongly copyleft, right? Something that explicitly prevents one party or, you know, a small number of parties from capitalizing and monopolizing something, right? So, you know, I think of things like the Linux kernel, right? This runs on almost every server on the planet, right?
Yeah.
I think of things like, you know, I personally think that like medical devices should also be strongly copyleft, but like that's a whole other thing. And in general, like things that like everyone needs and no one should have a monopoly on are good ideas for strong copyleft.
Insulin.
Insulin. Great example, right? Like a real world thing that should probably just not be owned by any individual, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like things that should be public domain and should stay public domain. And like any improvements on it should also be public domain, right? Like these fundamental things that we depend on, I think are really good candidates for that sort of stuff.
It's a really good way to put it. It makes a lot of sense hearing it that way.
And it also, especially if that utility, like if I write a Python script and I share it and it runs on Linux, the fact that Linux is not GPL or is GPL doesn't mean that anything that runs on Linux has to be too. There's like kind of a tier of separation there that means that it's not like using it in some ways does not force it to be viral for certain things too. So like, especially for Linux, it's still incredibly a powerful utility. It perpetuates the fact that it is going to have this license and stay open and stay like a public utility, but people can still do work on top of it and use it for stuff that is wide ranging too.
Exactly. Right. Like using a shovel doesn't mean that you're taking on the burden of, you know,
of the
license of the shovel. Right. Like,
right. Yeah.
It's not that would not be considered like a derivative or transformative work. Right.
Sure.
Like,
sure. Yeah.
Like you can put a different engine in your car and not have any idea how that engine works or deal with any licensing or anything like that. And that's fine.
But isn't that kind of viral though? Like if I put a viral license engine into my car, doesn't that kind of make me have to make the rest of the car license that way too?
We're getting into weirdness here, right?
Because I think about Marlin. Like we run Marlin is licensed GPL, and it's the firmware that we run on the Lumen PnP. And the fact that we run Marlin does not actually force us to license the Lumen's hardware that way. There's enough of a separation between the firmware running on the chip and the PCB design that houses the chip that virality does not transfer over. So like it's a weird blurry line of like, at what point is it integrated, right?
I don't think it's a blurry line at all because think about it this way, like the hardware and software are completely separate, right? I can run whatever software I want to on my Lumen, right?
Right.
So, they can be distributed separately. They can be updated separately. They can be replaced separately, right? Like it's a separate thing. And this is like actually called separability, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the key aspect of like what is considered a derivative or transformative work and what's not is this, or one of the principles is separability. And like in the case of like software running on hardware, they don't have to be the same or different. It's the same as like, if you're using an ASIC in your design or a chip, right? Like there are lots of chips out there that run software or gateway or like, something inside of them. But as long as those kind of chips are generally available and can be replaced or something like that in your design, that doesn't stop it from being open source, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
And same thing with software, right? Like, I can look at the open hardware design for the Lumen and knowing absolutely nothing about Marlin or having any idea of what it is.
Yeah.
If I wanted to use this control board, I would be able to write my own software or create or use some other software, adapt some other software to control the peripherals that chip is connected to, right?
Yeah.
So like, like that's sort of like the whole separability principle is like, like that chip interfaces with the world through well-known interfaces. The chip itself is documented.
Right.
The software that runs on it does not necessarily need to be the same thing. And that's actually where the Open Source Hardware Association's certification stuff comes in, because it encompasses both hardware, software, or say both. It encompasses hardware, software, documentation, and some other aspects of the project to make sure that the whole thing holistically is open source and not just one aspect of it.
Sure. Does this same methodology of like, there's a well-defined API kind of between these scopes? Like, I think about like Octoprint has a whole plugin system, a really cool plugin system. Octoprint doesn't need to know anything about that plugin. You can write your own plugin and install it, and Octoprint doesn't have to know about it. There's a well-defined API for making a plugin. Based on your description, I would posit that those plugins could be licensed differently too.
Yes.
Is that
absolutely.
fair to say? Okay. Okay. So it just has to have a pretty well-defined separation point, kind of like with the object files that you link to and stuff like that, like a similar kind of energy. And maybe that starts to blur the line a little bit.
Yeah.
Of like, it's still kind of the same file.
When we get into things like APIs, it's a little blurry, especially because of the Google versus Oracle decision and stuff like that. But generally speaking, an API is fair game, right? Like, I mean, essentially like running a program on Linux, right? Like writing a Linux program, you create an object, a binary that conforms to an API that the Linux kernel can understand and execute, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like that is an API. And, there's no, there's no requirement for programs that run on Linux to be GPL like Linux is.
Sure.
And the same thing is the case for Mac and Windows, right? Like there is a specific file format, a specific API, so to speak, that is required for programs to be able to run. And just because you use that doesn't mean that you are subject to the original license of the thing that's running it, right?
Right.
And the same thing for hardware, right? Like the I squared S is the API, right? I squared C is the API.
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
Like there's pretty decent hardware analogies to these sort of things where it's like, that's the API. Like your signaling protocol is the API, more or less.
Right. The different license things can shake hands. They just can't be part of each other necessarily. They also could be, but like it gets trickier when they're part of each other, but they can still interface and not be viral.
Yep. And that comes right back to separability.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is really cool, especially with one of my favorite things about this section is the CERN licenses, because they are so specific for hardware. But before we get into that, what do you mean by separability? Like, what does that mean to you?
I'm actually going to give you the legal definition.
The Merriam-Webster dictionary describes separability as
no, you don't look it up in Merriam. Merriam-Webster.
It's going to be the wrong definition.
Who gave them the right to define words?
Again, like it's complicated. Yeah. It's hard for me to summarize like something like this that's like just such a very specific thing. And like, there's different types of separability, right? Like for some like contracts, like the separability clause is not about like whether or not things can talk to each other. It's about if there's some part of this contract that isn't legal, then the rest of the contract is still legal. Like it's that sort of nonsense, right?
Yeah.
So like it's absurd, right? Like I don't think I can give a good definition in a podcast context, but like
that's cool.
Basically it comes down to, can this thing exist without the original work? Right.
Okay.
Like, and it's easier to think about that in the context of like art or like a book or something, right? Like, you know, part of like this goes into fair use as well, where it's like you can create a work that is commentary on another work. That is fair use, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though that work cannot exist without the original work, because you can't comment on something that doesn't exist. The fact that it is transformative in that way, in the way of commentary or parody or so on, like something like that,
right?
That's okay. So you kind of get it into that aspect of copyright where you're like thinking about whether or not the work can exist on its own. And if it can't, what is the context in which it exists? Does it exist to be commentary? Does it exist to be parody? Does it exist to be interoperable? And this the interoperability clause that comes into play, right? Like that concept comes into play with this sort of stuff, where it's like, you know, this is doing whatever, but it's talking through this thing, and I want to interoperate with that thing. So I also have to talk the thing.
Yeah.
Even if, you know, that API is under the copyright of the original work, wanting to interoperate with it is allowed, right? That's fair use.
So if I make a parser for like a SolidWorks file format, that's a proprietary piece of software.
Yeah.
And how they have that is, if I reverse engineer how it works and I make a library of like SolidWorks to FreeCAD file, I've been thinking about this actually a lot. Like that would be really cool. But and that's kind of allowed, right? Like
that's 100% allowed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. There's one exception to this, is that you can't circumvent copy protection when doing this, but
is this DMCA stuff?
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
But, you know, for things like file formats that are just like, you know, stuff that you created and saved from some program, like generally speaking, like that interoperability is fine, right?
But if they put some like private key, like decryption thing that you have to buy the key to like decrypt your file, that's copy protection, right? No, that's not copy protection. That's just encryption. So what would be an example of this in the SolidWorks situation where it wouldn't be allowed? Is there a way that Dassault systems could do that?
An easier analogy here is actually video games. So if you create software that breaks Nintendo's copy protection, their lawyers will come at you with all the force and anger that they can possibly summon.
Rip Yuzu.
Yeah, they're gonna drop Bowser on you.
They're going to send like a special ops team out of a helicopter to find you.
Right.
And that's technically their right to do that, right?
Yep.
Even though like if you were like, let's say you wanted to make a console that could play Nintendo DS games or 3DS games, which are actually encrypted, you would need to break that copy protection, that encryption, to do that. And in that case, you're not breaking copyright law, you're breaking the DMCA or whatever.
But even if you're not trying to redistribute the game, you're just trying to play it on your own hardware that you made, which is kind of interfacing with the API of the game.
And again, it's totally fine to do that. You can make a thing that's interoperable, right?
Right.
Where it's weird is that if you break copy protection, that's where it's weird. So if you made, for example, a 3DS console on an FPGA, that's fine. But if you made it where you plug in a retail cartridge that's encrypted, or use a dumped retail cartridge, which is encrypted, and you can play that game there through that, that's not cool. If you can make it where it only plays already unencrypted games, that's fine.
Oh my gosh. So they're gating interoperability behind copy protection. So you cannot make. This reminds me of that Bunny Huang project where he made it was like that HDMI splice thing where you could effectively feed in one HDMI port and it would, in this crazy like eggshell dance of a way, splice in a visual overlay on top of that HDMI stream, but not actually interface with the stream. I don't know enough to be intelligent talking about it, but it is a fascinating write-up of like his interpretation of HDMI and his requirements and like, is it copy protected? Is it decoding all of this stuff? And It's so cool. We'll put a link in the description for whatever the heck it is that I read about this, but it's very interesting how he kind of worked around that.
Yeah. And, there are real world cases of this, right? Nintendo shut down a very popular Switch emulator called Yuzu because Yuzu included the code that was able to decrypt the games so it could circumvent copy protection. If Yuzu had not done that, there is another Switch emulator that is in that situation where they don't have the code that circumvents copy protection. Nintendo may not have had a legal leg to stand on.
Yeah,
because there is actually case law, PlayStation versus Bleem, about like emulators are illegal because it's interoperability, right?
Right. They're illegal or legal?
Legal. They are
legal. Okay.
Yeah. They are fair use. Yeah. So totally fine to write an emulator for a console. Not fine to break the copy protection of the console so you can play games on that emulator.
Wild. That's such a specific line.
Yeah. And again, this isn't part of copyright law. It's part of the the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, right? So it's a separate piece of that.
Yeah. A totally separate thing from all this.
This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah,
Holy
this
hell.
is, there's a lot. There's a lot to make sure you're not stepping on toes and which toes you really don't want to step on. So you also do this thing with your projects that I really like. And this is what I thought you meant when you were talking about separability, which is you license all the separate parts of your projects differently. So you have, okay. So you have your docs license with one license. You have your hardware design with one license. You have your software design with one license. I think this is really cool. And it makes a lot of sense because different licenses are for different things. And it makes sense to split it up that way.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, again, it goes back to the idea of like, the documentation is a separate thing, really, right? Like it's a totally separate thing. Like you can make an open source hardware project and never document it.
Or write docs for a thing that doesn't exist.
And the same thing with hardware, right? Like, you look at a lot of 3D printer control boards, right? Like Big Tree Tech can design a control board and never write a single line of software, right? It's just, they are truly separate projects. Even if you put them all in the same repository and send them all out into the world, and even if you apply the same license to all of them, they are technically separate things, right?
Yeah.
But so, I personally think it's important to use an appropriate license for these distinct parts, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of software licenses aren't really all that great for applying to hardware. Right. And again, the case law for open source hardware is vanishingly small.
Yeah.
But in general, when you're doing a license, when you're writing up a contract, you want to use the terms, like the definitions, like the terminology and everything that match reality, right? Match what people who are talking about the actual thing would use.
Right.
And in the case of hardware versus software, the terminology is so different. The ideas, the practical use of these things are so different, right?
Yeah.
So, in a lot of ways, it helps to use a license specifically designed for hardware because it makes it clear to the people who are using it what their rates are, like what they're able to do with it, right?
Yeah.
So that's important. That's super important to me, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And like the best example I can think of this is if you read a bunch of information from the CERN OHL is a great license for open hardware. It literally describes the line drawn between like sending a bit stream to an FPGA and like how licensing certain things, which is like an FPGA is like beautifully on the precipice between software and hardware. So like they found that weird explicit part and they're like trying to make it clear. How would this actually play out with their license? I love the OHL. I think it's a really cool thing that exists. Yeah.
So the CERN OHL is basically the perfect 3 sets of licenses for open source hardware.
Yeah.
I truly don't think that in most cases, an individual does not need to reach for a different set of licenses for hardware specifically.
Really? It's just panacea for any, depending on where you fall in your permissive scale.
Yeah. So for context, for people who don't know, CERN's open hardware licenses have 3 flavors, which are designed to cover that range from permissive to strongly reciprocal. So they have permissive version, which is called OHLP. They have the weakly reciprocal version, which is OHL-W, and then they have the strongly reciprocal version, which is OHL-S. So they have these 3 licenses that cover those 3 intents, basically. And within those licenses, like it covers and uses terminology specific for hardware and makes it very clear to both you and whoever's using your stuff what their rights and responsibilities are. And I think that that's really fantastic. It is absolutely possible to use a different set of licenses. You can use Creative Commons licenses. If you're feeling like a mad lad, you can use GPL for hardware, but like how that's actually going to play out in practice, if it ever gets challenged, is it's up for debate. But like, it's not just about like what happens when we go to court. It's about if someone wants to use this, is it clear what they can do with it? Right.
Right. Yeah. Is it explicit?
Yeah. Because with GPL, it's not always clear. With these software licenses, if you apply them to hardware, it's really unclear what the actual rights are. So
right. Yeah. Are there any other like hardware specific licenses? Like CERN OHL is kind of the only one that I'm aware of that is very specifically suited towards hardware design.
There are a couple.
Okay.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I can't remember any, but there are at least a couple of more of them. Like CERN was not the first to take a stab at it, but they're the ones that took a very concerted effort with the help of like actual legal experts that are familiar with hardware to draft this. Right. So
yep.
I personally think they're about all you would need. If you need something other than these three, then you should be talking to a lawyer and drafting up your own.
You're writing your own license.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. So what is your spread? If you have a new project, and I know this is going to depend very much on the project, how do you view? So this has all just kind of been like what the lay of the land is. Mm-hmm. But now I'm curious of like, how do you view these licenses? Like we did a little bit already with like the Linux kernel and stuff, but you know, what do you think about when you choose, to someone listening who's like trying to start their own thing and trying to pick a license for it? What guidelines do you use to decide? Because I know that you will change your licenses quite a bit depending on what the thing is. Sometimes it's totally hands off. Sometimes you have a weekly reciprocal. It varies for you. So what's your process of picking one? And like, what are some examples of things you've settled on for different projects?
Sure. I mean, for any projects that I do personally or anything that I do as Winterbloom, my music tech company that makes synthesizers, is all like very permissive.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my personal default, is just very permissive. Like my personal goal is to educate and empower people through technology. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the best way for my projects to do that is to give people the right to do whatever they want to with them, right? More or less, right? Yep. So I lean very heavily towards permissive licensing. So for me, that means that for hardware, it's CERN OHL-P. For software, it's generally Apache or MIT. Mm-hmm. And for documentation, it's Creative Commons attribution stuff. So
not share alike.
Not share alike.
Which is the permissive variant.
Yeah, just attribution. So yeah, like that's cool for me.
Sure.
You know, like when I work with other companies, there's often other considerations, right? Where like, they're like, well, we want this, but we don't want to let someone else take it and then run with it and make a competing product or service and, you know, completely wipe us off of the face of the earth without giving anything back to the project. Mm-hmm. And that's where we start talking about reciprocal licenses and like what that should be. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, I recommend weekly reciprocal, where it's like, if they take it and they use something, they should obviously give back whatever changes they make. But if they make something that's purely derivative, like, or like that just uses it, that doesn't actually change it, but like uses it as part of the bigger whole, we shouldn't tie them down to releasing everything like that, right? Because like that can actually be a barrier to adoption for some projects, right?
Right, yeah.
But then there's other cases where someone's like, you know, I want to make something that should have extremely like sort of widespread, like no one should be able to, you know, exclusively control this.
It should be a public utility like internet or
and then
water,
that's when I start talking about we do strongly reciprocal, like viral, copyleft sort of things. But I personally hardly ever recommend anyone do anything that's viral or strongly reciprocal. And that's just like, ultimately, I feel like there aren't a lot of things that fall into that category.
Yeah. It's like the Linux kernel.
Yeah. For companies or people that I talk to, like it's very rare that I run into something where I'm like, no, this makes sense for you to make this strongly, you know, copyleft and strongly reciprocal. It's like rarely is that the case. It's and again, it's also an ideological stance more than a practical stance, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it is really more about like what they're into, I guess.
Yeah, because the whole Lumen project is licensed with GPL, which is strongly reciprocal. And this came from, you know, little baby Steven in 2021 was like, what licenses do people use? And I poked through a handful of them, but like definitely, I don't think I did my due diligence back then. And I picked GPL because it felt like the viral thing was the thing that was going to enforce open source more. It was going to make people make more open source, and more open source is more good. And like, I do feel that. And now I feel more like it's restrictive. Like I'm being opinionated and I'm forcing someone to do it in a way I've dictated. And my great example, like Opula's mission is to help people manufacture their products. That's the thesis behind the whole project. The whole thing is to help people do that. If someone wants to use the Lumen as a basis for something that they want to be proprietary, I don't want to yuck their yum. If they want to do that, that's great. I don't want to force them to. They aren't going to use it if it's GPL, because it's going to influence, like kind of the example I gave earlier of the pipetting machine. If someone makes this crazy patented proprietary pipetting pressure system, whatever the hell it is, and they want to just strap it onto a Lumen and then use the Lumen as the basis. Right now, if they tried to do it with the Lumen as is, they would have to open source all this other stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to force them to do that. I want them to use it. So I'm kind of leaning more towards a weekly reciprocal thing now. Because like if they do make a change, let's say they fix a bug, they got the benefit of the fact we did all this work. And I still want the whole Lumen project to get better as a result of the fact that it's open. But I don't want to be opinionated about what they do. So I think I've settled much more from a strongly reciprocal into a weekly reciprocal mentality about what it makes sense to run. But I don't know. I'm looking into the process of trying to see if folks are interested in that switch, because all the contributors need to sign off on it and see if people are interested in making that change over. Because more people will be able to use it comfortably for their application if we make it more permissive.
More open, more better.
Yeah. But it's a different kind of more open, right? Because like strongly reciprocal is forcing other things to be open. So it's like more freedom, more better, more like, fewer obligations, fewer strings attached. I don't know. And Thea, a lot of that came from conversations with you, I think, where like I really felt like it was like well, no, I want to force this. And it's like, well, what's really being free? What's really having it no strings attached is like, it's public domain. It's like no hands.
I mean, like, and you could read a lot about this, but the whole difference between free as in beer and free as in freedom, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's tricky. It's very tricky. And like I said, there's some deep philosophical arguments.
There are.
Yeah. I mean, I personally think that what makes the most sense for people is to lean towards free as in beer. And that also to some extent gives free as in freedom. The whole idea of copyleft, and you can read, if you really want, you can read Richard Stallman's, treatises on this sort of thing.
Right.
Please read them with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
There are some compelling ideas in there. There's some compelling philosophy behind copyleft and that sort of subversion of the copyright system.
Yep.
But I also think that from a practical standpoint, those things can limit the freedom of people to do certain things with your works.
Right.
So, I don't know.
It depends. It depends on what you want to do, and how you want to run it, and what's your ethos. If your ethos is, I want to make a lot of money and I don't want anyone to take it, then like, it's interesting you're listening to this episode to begin with.
Yeah. If your strategy for making money depends on your thing not being cloned, you are screwed.
You're done. Because Apple AirPods have been cloned 1,000,001 times and they have every patent under the sun. Like, it doesn't matter.
There is no amount of patents or copyright that is going to save you from someone cloning you. And you are going to need an army of lawyers to stop that.
Right.
So, ultimately, secrets don't make successful companies.
No.
There's other things that make successful companies and other things that make successful projects, right?
Yeah.
Secrets are not one of them.
Although it can feel compelling too. Like, I have a lot of friends who, it's my favorite thing because it's the first question someone asks you when you're like, I do an open hardware thing. And they're like, aren't you afraid it's going to get cloned or something? It's like, no. Like, it already, well, part of it is a bring it. And part of it is it doesn't matter. Like, it's still going to happen. If it does, that's a sign that it's a useful thing that other people want, and I'm on the right track. Like, it's market validation, if anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's
yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, especially with open source hardware, right? Specifically with open source hardware, publishing the design files and the source files and stuff like that. If someone's going to clone you, you've made things just slightly easier for them.
Just a little. Yeah.
Yeah. You've made 10% of their job easier.
Yeah.
They still have a whole 90% of your job that they have to replicate.
Right.
And that's
yeah.
a lot harder than just copying some source files.
Sure. I think there are some exceptions. Like I think about the Thunderscope, and like there is a crazy amount of development and testing and processing in the source. Like the Lumen motherboard is not crazy complicated. Like anyone with some good EE experience could make a similar board. Like it's not terrible. Like we've done a lot of tuning and tweaking to get it really good, but something like the Thunderscope is wild. Like that's a crazy amount of dev. So I think opening up that source or keeping that closed would slow someone down. It's just that feels very antithetical to like generally progress as people here trying to make a cool thing.
I mean, you would think that would slow somebody down, but you could send that board off to a lab and they would have you a replica of it.
You're right. Yeah, you can just buy one and of course. Yeah, that's a.
I mean, of course, you inherit all the bugs and you have no idea how it actually works, but you can make a clone of it in a heartbeat, right? Like
sure. And you can reverse engineer. You can sand down and take pictures of the traces and remake a schematic. And then you do understand how it works and you can fix those bugs. And like anything is open source with enough investigation. What's that line? Everything's open source if you read assembly or something.
Yeah,
like there's a line about that.
Exactly. Yeah. Everything is open source if you understand assembly. And yeah. I mean, you might not be able to get the original source, but you can get a source, right?
Sure,
like,
sure.
You know, like it comes back to that. And like ultimately, like, and this is also another weird aspect of open source hardware is that like, copyright generally doesn't apply to a hardware design, like a PCB design or like a schematic, right? Like what we're actually applying the license to is the source files. We're not applying it to the concept inside the source files. And in some ways, we're not even really applying it to the PCB itself, right?
Right. It's the design files.
It's the design files. It's the published work. That's the work, right? There's case law, ruling that schematics cannot be copyrighted. You can patent an invention that uses electronics that contains a schematic, right? Like Bob Moog patented the ladder filter in the Moog synthesizer. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the schematic itself and even the printed circuit board is not copyrightable, right?
Well, so is the KiCad file, because the KiCad file contains the schematic.
That's what we're leaning on, right? Like that's the thing that we're leaning on is it's the source files that we are applying copyright to.
Sure.
That's crazy because I can see an argument that schematics are in software the equivalent of source code, and you can copyright an algorithm.
So you can copyright source code, a specific drawing, but you cannot copyright the circuit that drawing represents.
Oh, sure.
And when there is a limited amount of ways that you can express a specific circuit, it becomes vanishingly hard to enforce copyright on that. Right. So, for example, I can write up a schematic right now in KiCad, and I could use my fancy, page layout that I have, and I can draw a non-inverting buffer schematic, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I could publish that. I could license it. And if someone tried to copy that file as is and redistribute it, I could technically, bully them about it, right?
Yeah.
If someone looked at that and they were like, oh, cool, so that's an inverting amplifier, and drew the same thing, I have no recourse, right? Like that's totally valid, right?
Yeah. It's like you can't patent an implementation of like a linked list in code. Right. It's like there's only so many freaking ways to do that, and like it's trivial to. It's not a novel, like, right? Isn't that one of the bars for a patent?
It's one of the bars. It's not a novel. And like, it's also like a recipe, right? Like you can't really patent a recipe, right? Or you can patent a recipe. You cannot copyright a recipe, right? Like, yeah. And so like, that's where things get interesting, right? So yeah, it's weird stuff. It's weird stuff.
Yeah, it is weird stuff.
Like ultimately at the end of the day, it's not about, having the right incantations to make the law work for you, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, what open source is about is trying to establish a commons of work that other people can use and learn from, right? Mm-hmm. And all these licenses do is give us, in some ways, like a means of expressing our intent and our desires for the people who are using these commons.
Right.
And enforceability is a completely different topic, and maybe you'll have to have me on a third time to talk
For
about
another
it.
one. Well, and it's money dependent. Like that was another point I wanted to make.
It's money dependent, right?
It's like you can have that license and it's great and people know, cool, this is the way they're putting this out there and they can feel comfortable or not comfortable using it based on that license. But unless you have a ton of money you want to throw at a lawyer to try and take someone down, it doesn't mean anything. It's just like a lease for renting an apartment. Like you have to like take them to small claims or whatever.
Yeah.
If you want to take it up, like there's more to do.
And the inverse is true too, right? Like if you are on the receiving end of a lawsuit related to copyright and you don't have resources.
Right. Yeah.
Even if there's a very slim chance the lawsuit will rule in their favor.
Right.
If you don't have the money to fight it, you're boned.
You're done. Yeah.
Going back to the example of Nintendo and Yuzu, there was actually a very strong chance that they could make a case that what they were doing was totally fine. There is a chance that the way that in which they were circumventing the copyright protection did not actually constitute a violation of, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, right?
Yeah.
But Nintendo's got far more resources than these developers have.
Yeah.
So when Nintendo sent them the cease and desist, Nintendo served them with, my bad. Nintendo didn't send the cease and desist. They sent them a friggin' lawsuit. They settled. The developers settled. They didn't even take it to court. They didn't even do anything. Yeah. They settled because even with the precedence of PlayStation versus Bleem, where it's like emulators are legal, and there's some other case law that people were throwing around saying like, this is like Yuzu could fight this and win. Yeah. Like there's more than a 50% chance that Yuzu could fight this and win. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, they don't have the resources to do it.
With what money?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably why Nintendo preferred a settlement, because they can control the situation better. They're afraid of a GoFundMe that gives Yuzu the funds needed for a powerful lawsuit or a countersuit. I mean,
exactly. Because like Nintendo's playing with fire, because if they do this to someone with resources, what happens is if it goes to court and it gets settled, like when I say settled, if it gets ruled on, right, that establishes precedent, and that means that they can't do anything else, right? Like that makes their subsequent takedowns a lot harder.
I wonder if that's why there's so little case law about these things, is that they use scare tactics and try and settle out of court so that it still remains ambiguous and money just kind of wins.
Yeah. And I mean, like ultimately, a lot of the reason why we don't see a lot of case law around specifically software licenses and open source stuff is because for the most part, people aren't really infringing like maliciously.
Yeah.
And you can read about this in Creative Commons, like FAQ about enforcement, but like generally speaking, it's an accident. So like most of the time it's like people talk and they get it resolved. Right.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to assume malicious intent, but that's usually not the case.
Yeah.
And ultimately, like the goal isn't to punish people who break license terms. It's just to get people to play.
Exactly.
It's just like, we're all at the playground. We're all playing, dodgeball or whatever. We're trying to keep the kids from like taking a baseball and using it as a dodgeball, right? Like that's ultimately our goal here. It's not to beat up the kid that's winning, right? Like,
sure. That's true. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like ultimately we want people to be good members of the community. And in a lot of ways, like you don't make that happen by suing people. You make that happen by
sending them a message.
Sending them a message and then encouraging them to do the right thing, and then using the community to pressure companies into doing the right thing. And ultimately that's going to work a little bit better than suing someone usually. So
yeah, I made this mistake a few years ago, and I made like a mask. It was like built out of PCBs. It was like a 3D circuit board structure. And I used a very popular low poly face model, and I totally flubbed the attribution for, it was a Creative Commons with attribution, not sure, like, or something like that. I did not do my due diligence. And the guy was like, dude, what the hell? And I was like, oh crap, I'm sorry, dude. I'm like, it was an accident. Like I was just a dumb kid and I didn't know, I wasn't paying attention to that yet. I wasn't aware of that scope of these things. I was just blindly skipping through this project and not thinking about it. And that really sat with me. It's like, yeah, this is not you have to be, anytime you pull anything, you have to be so aware of this. It's so freaking important to do that attribution and be aware of it.
Yeah.
That sat with me.
Yeah. I mean, try to be a cool person, right? Like that, like ultimately, like that's what it comes down to, right? Like people are giving you this stuff for free. Try to be pretty chill about it, right? Like,
just don't be an ass. That's the whole license.
Like the whole of open source is founded on one principle, which is DBA. Don't be an asshole. And ultimately, that's the summary. Like when it comes to licensing, like, you know, think about what your intent is. And when you're using stuff, don't be an asshole.
A beautiful button. That's a great look on the episode. You guys have any other nuggets to drop in?
I had one question for Thea.
Okay.
Basically, I propose that maybe there's a little case law with open source license infringements because sometimes it might be hard to show the damages fiscally or like intellectually. Mm-hmm. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Like if we 100% ripped Marlin, not that we ever would, but who is damaged by that? Who would be the one to take us to court over it, basically?
That's a great question. And it's such a good question. Because people are like, oh, you know, is the Open Source Hardware Association the open source police? And it's like, no, we're not taking people's kneecaps, right? Like we're a community organization. We're trying to highlight open source, not be police.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the author is the person who has the right to take you to court over something like that, right? Because again, this is a contract, and a community organization like the Open Source Hardware Association is not party to that contract, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not, we don't hold the copyright. It's you that holds the copyright. So like, you know, if you ripped off Marlin, then Marlin's authors would have the right collectively to come after you for that, right? I mean, like there's ways that they can delegate that responsibility to somebody else, but like ultimately that's who would try to boss you around. And like the point of like community, like organizations like OSHWA and OSI and others, right, is to kind of help facilitate these conversations before they get into legal matters, right? Like it's like we can help you find and talk to somebody if you feel like they're maliciously taking advantage of your work, but like ultimately we're not going to be the ones filing court proceedings in the end, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, it'd be exhausting and financially draining to do such a thing.
And infinite.
Yeah. I aspire to one day put up the funds to have like open office hours with a legal expert on this stuff that open hardware companies and open source contributors can hop into and ask questions, just like Steve and I had the benefit of talking to you here, because this all is, it's so confusing. There's so many conflicting facts. There's so much wrong info out there. It's just so important to be able to hear from you on this. So thank you.
Yeah. And again, I am not a lawyer. I'm what lawyers would call a subject matter expert.
Yeah.
But ultimately I'm not a lawyer. So like, you know, I read about these cases. I, you know, stay informed. I, you know, have talked to many lawyers about this sort of stuff, but ultimately I did not pass the bar. I am not a lawyer. So like there are ramifications and things on this that do require some serious conversation with a lawyer, and every case is different. So like, you know, if you are in doubt, like these are great rules of thumb, but if you are in doubt, please talk to a lawyer.
Talk to a lawyer. Yep. And
Creative Commons has a curated list of lawyers that are very well versed in open source.
Do they really? That's awesome.
I believe so. I'm 90% sure on that.
Cool.
If they don't, I'm so sorry.
If it does exist, it'll be in the episode notes.
Awesome. Wonderful.
I think I've seen it. Yeah, that covered my second question. Is how can people find more legal resources? And beautiful.
Yeah, there it is. And probably OSHWA. Does OSHWA have...
We don't. It's one thing that I would like for us to do is get a list of lawyers that are not only just familiar with open source, but familiar with open source hardware.
Yeah. That'd be really cool.
And not so much for enforcement, just for helping people figure out what they should do.
Right. Yeah. Oh, wow. Thea, thank you for being such a wonderful guide of distilling down like this whole scope of stuff. Because it's a lot. If you just want to make a thing and you want to put it out there and you think open source is rad, it's very easy to just click a drop down in GitHub's open new repo, pick your license. And there's only like 10 in there, and CERN OHL is not in there. Mozilla, the MPL v2 is not in there. Like you have to explicitly put it in there. It's weird. It's like you don't really know how to approach it. So thanks for sharing the knowledge. It's really helpful to have your experience on this.
Of course. Yeah. Anytime. I hope this was helpful and not just a bunch of just tangents.
No, it was rad. All the tangents were well suited.
Yeah. I would also recommend choosealicense.com. They have great resources and they also cover hardware as well. So
cool. Okay. Oh, I think I've seen this before. Yeah.
There's also the TLDR legal, which is great for understanding sort of what licenses require and stuff like that. So also a great resource.
Awesome. Was it called TLDR Legal?
Mm-hmm. And this one's specifically for software licenses, but it is very helpful.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Thanks again, Thea. This has been fun.
Of course. Thank you, guys.
All right, folks, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us out a ton. You can find Opulo on Twitter and Instagram. You can also email us at podcast@opulo.io with questions or comments about this episode. I'm sure it'll be a lot. Also, please don't forget to check out opulo.io and sign up for our newsletter where we write blog posts and do customer interviews with other folks building open hardware. Thea, where can people find you?
I pray that they don't. But they can find me at thea.codes, thea.codes. That's my website. It's got all my links on there. And they can find me in the Opulo Discord. I'm Stargirl on there, so you can bother me there as well. So yeah, don't find me in real life. I don't want to see you.
Let her find you.
Yeah. If you need me, I'll arrive.
Yes, exactly.
Well, that sounds great. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya. I went back to college.
Yeah, Lucian, you were whipping through notes like it was a fucking lecture.
Just invite me on so I can school you boys.
It was clown on the nerds, or what's the phrase?
Stump the chumps.
Stump the
Stump the chumps.